Well, when I was 11, and my only sibling, my brother Damien, was 12 and a half, my parents moved to Spain. Oh, said my mother, it's going to be wonderful. Sea and sun and sand. Yes, said my father, it's going to be paradise. And they bought a house on the side of a mountain, and on a clear day you could see Gibraltar and Africa. It was paradise. And Damien and I have never been so bored. Now, it must be said, we weren't there very often. My family was a good Irish Catholic family, and so they sent Damien and I back to boarding school in England. Damien went to a monastery with monks, and I went to a convent with nuns. So we were only there during the holidays. But one of the reasons that we found it so boring was that my parents loved to entertain. They were marvellous at it. And in our family, you had to be able to silver serve by the age of 10. So Damien and I were always the help at the parties. Well, when I was 14 and Damien was 15 and a half, my mother asked us if we would make a sangria for one of her lunch parties. Now, the incredible thing is that I ever reached the age of 14. Because my brother Damien is very, very curious, and he loves to experiment. And he loves to experiment on me. So, for example, when I was 7 and he was 8 and a half, my parents had had a party in England, and Damien had come down early. And on the side in the kitchen, there was a glass of clear liquid. And he looked at it and he thought, looks like water. Doesn't quite smell like water. I wonder what it is. I wonder if it's poison. I know what I'll do. I'll try it out on Geraldine. And if she keels over dead, then I'll know not to have any. So that's what happened. I came down and Damien went, oh, Geraldine, he said, try this lovely glass of water. And I said, all right, Damien. It was vodka. He'd given me straight vodka. And then when I was 8 and he was 9 and a half, he decided he wanted to experiment. He wanted to see if he put me in a trunk and slid me down a steep slope of stairs. Would I live? Well, thank goodness I did. And then when I was 10 and he was 11 and a half, he said, ooh, Geraldine, let's have some fun today. And I said, oh, all right, Damien. He said, let's play cowboys and Indians. He said, I'll tie you up by the hands and by the ankles. I'll gag you. I'll throw you in the closet, and then you can do the same thing for me. And I said, oh, all right, Damien. So that's what happened. He tied me up by the hands and by the ankles. He gagged me. He threw me in the closet, and then he promptly forgot about me. Because my aunt arrived at that moment with all of our cousins, and there was this glorious hullabaloo in the house. And it was only 2 hours later that my aunt said, and where's Geraldine? And I still trusted him, even when I was 14 and he was 15 and a half, and we were asked to make that sangria. So Damien said to me, let's have some fun with this. And so I said, well, you can imagine, can't you? Oh, all right, Damien. So we got out the big bowl that we always made the sangria in, and we chopped up apples and oranges, and we put them in there with sugar and brandy, and that's the basis of it, and you let it stew. And so Damien said to me, let's add some other things. So I said, oh, all right, Damien. Well, my father was having a lovely time in Spain. He was going to different supermarkets, and he was buying liqueurs and other alcohol that you couldn't get in England at the time. And he had this wonderful collection, all of pretty bottles with beautiful labels. So Damien said, let's put some of those in. And he picked up one and he went, ooh, he said, melon liqueur. Ooh, that looks good. Glug, 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 glug. Ooh, orange liqueur. Glug, glug, glug. Ooh, applejack brandy. Glug, 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 glug. Don't worry, Geraldine, he said, it's all fruit. And then he found a bottle of vodka and put that in. Glug, 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 glug. And then we added what you always add, which is bottles of red wine and Spanish lemonade, which is like 7-Up and ice. Well, about that time, my parents' friends started to arrive. Now, my parents had retired rather young, and so their friends were older than they were, and they were nearly all old colonials. Well, Damien and I, we thought they were ancient. We knew that all of them had to be at least 100. They had to be. So every time they came to the house, what we wanted to say to them was, hello, how are you? Welcome. Wheelchairs on the right, walkers on the left. But we never did, because we were too well behaved, really. Well, my mother, she gathered up all her friends and she took them to a terrace on one side of the house that had been set up for them, and Damien and I started to serve lunch. Now, my parents were wonderful cooks, and on that day they'd made a paella, and we were going to serve it with the salad and bread and, of course, the sangria. Well, one of the other reasons that Damien and I found Spain to be so boring was that every time these friends came round, it seemed to our ears that they always had exactly the same conversation. And it went along the lines of, when I was in Puna, children should be seen and not heard. I lost 2 kilos this week. The best gin fizz you can possibly have is in Raffles in Singapore. And when I was in Dubai, they went on and on and on. Well, after the first glass of this sangria, they were loosened up and they were laughing. After the second glass of this sangria, these ancient old grandmas and these ancient old grandfathers, they were dancing. They were cavorting. They were cavorting. And after the third glass of this sangria, Damien and I, we were getting an education. One ancient old man was checking out one ancient old woman. He looked her up and down and he said, "Come over here, darling, and let Daddy teach you how to tango." Well, really, really. Well, at that moment, the front doorbell went and I went to see who it was. And standing on the doorstep was a nun in full black habit. And behind her there was a minivan and it was just bursting with nuns. They were all shimmering in the hot Spanish heat. It was the Little Sisters of the Poor, and they had chosen that moment to come round collecting alms. Well, I went to get my mother. Now, my mother was a good Irish Catholic woman and she loved nuns. And in fact, she had a friend who was a nun in England, and that friend told her that whenever they went round collecting alms, no one ever invited them in to use the restroom. Because everybody thinks that nuns have cast iron bladders. And they don't. No, really, they don't. So my mother invited them all in to use the facilities, and afterwards they were standing in the hallway, and they started to sniff. They could smell the paella, and it smelled wonderful. They looked, for all the world, like a very friendly pack of black Labrador retrievers. They could smell the onions and the peppers and the garlic, oh, and the juicy pieces of chicken and the mussels and the prawns all swaddled in saffron rice. They were beginning to drool. Well, my mother looked at them and she looked at the clock. It was well past 2:30. Clearly these nuns had not eaten lunch. They were hungry. Well, in our family, to be hungry is a cardinal sin. So she said, sisters, you must come in, you must join us for lunch. No, I insist. And she swept them all to another patio on the other side of the house that she quickly had set up. It was the other side from our other rather inebriated guests on this side. And Damien and I started to serve them paella and salad and bread and water. And my mother said, "Oh, no, the sisters must have sangria." Well, Damien and I were in the most terrible predicament. We knew there was enough alcohol in this sangria to lay low a longhorn. But now, in our defense, we did know that these were Spanish religious, so they will be a little more used to strong wine than, say, American religious, but this strong wine. But what could we do? The only other thing we could have done was to confess, and we couldn't do that because we would have got into the most terrible trouble. So we poured the sangria. Well, there was one chief nun, very, very elegant, and all the other nuns were sitting there watching her. And she picked up her glass and took a sip, and all the other nuns were staring. And as she took a sip, a smile went across her face. And so all the other nuns took a sip. And that smile went around that circle like an electric current. Well, after the first glass of that sangria, those nuns were chatting away like starlings. After the second glass of that sangria, they were laughing, and the chief nun, her wimple had slipped right across one eye. And after the third glass of that sangria, well, they were singing. But it seems as though as the spirit went in them, the real spirit that was in them came out. because those nuns were singing hymns. Beautiful, beautiful verses in Spanish, which I didn't really understand, but long, long choruses of Alleluia, Alleluia, and I can't sing at all, but Alleluia. And that sound, it filled the house, it filled the terrace, it filled the hills with praise. Well, our other inebriated guests, they staggered out at about 4:30, but the nuns were still singing hymns at 6 o'clock. And when they left, they prayed for Damien and I, and they blessed us. And I'm quite sure it's those prayers and blessings that enable me to not murder my brother through our childhood, and even into adulthood. It made sure I stayed on the right side of the bars, and it made sure that Damien and I stayed on the straight and narrow all this time. And you know something? Whenever I think about those nuns, I think it was the God of love and laughter that I serve. I believe it was him who sent the nuns. Because perhaps, just for a nanosecond, he too was bored in paradise.